January 20th, 1983. A boat club parking lot in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. Detectives opened the trunk of a Cadillac and found Roy DeMeo inside, partly frozen, a chandelier on top of him. Investigators credited his crew with as many as 200 killings. This is why the real Roy DeMeo story is worse than the Goodfellas. Section 1. Roy DeMeo's Origins. September 7th, 1940. Brooklyn, New York, in a working-class Italian-American household whose roots ran back to Formia, a coastal town in the Lazio region south of Rome. Antonio DeMeo, known as Anthony, worked as a delivery man for a laundry company. His wife, Eleanor Colarulo, kept the house. Their fourth child of 5 was a boy named Roy Albert DeMeo. Some accounts give his birth year as 1942. Most give 1940. The family lived in Flatlands, in the southeastern corner of the borough. The family absorbed 2 losses early. An older brother, known as Chubby, was killed in the Korean War in 1951. Antonio DeMeo died of a heart attack in 1960. DeMeo attended James Madison High School and graduated in 1959. 2 of his classmates in that graduating year went on to public careers, the economist Walter Block and the future United States Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. Between the ages of 15 and 22, DeMeo worked at a local grocery store, where he trained as an apprentice butcher. That detail is documented, and it is also the detail most often used to explain what his crew later did to bodies. The training is verified. The causal link between the training and the crimes is an interpretation offered by writers, not a finding made by any court. A police informant reported that DeMeo described murder as the power of God, deciding who lives and who dies. That remark reaches the record through an informant rather than through a confession or sworn testimony, and it is repeated here with that qualification attached. While he was still at school, DeMeo began lending money at interest. Loan sharking is the business he never left, and the mechanics of it explain most of what follows. A borrower needs cash and cannot get it from a bank, either because he has no credit history or because the reason for needing the money cannot be written on a form. An unlicensed lender supplies it at a rate far above the legal limit, collected weekly. The standard street arrangement was borrow 5 and pay back 6, with the weekly payment covering interest only. The principal stayed where it was, unless the borrower produced the whole sum at once, which most of them never did. The business runs without paperwork, without a credit check, and without access to a court. A bank that is not paid files suit. An unlicensed lender who is not paid has one instrument available, which is a threat the borrower believes. Loan sharking, therefore, requires a standing capacity for violence, and it produces a steady population of people who owe money they cannot repay. Those people are the second product. A borrower short of cash can hand over a share of his business, or the use of his premises, or the keys to a trucking company, a body shop, a restaurant, or a bar. Defaulted loans are the mechanism by which organized crime moved into legitimate businesses across New York through most of the 20th century. The automobile trade mattered more than any other category on his books, and it mattered for a structural reason. Car dealers, repair shops, and body shops are capital-intensive businesses run on thin margins by owners who need cash quickly and often cannot document where it went. They also come with premises, tools, lifts, paint booths, and the lawful ability to hold vehicles for weeks. A lender who takes a share of enough of them ends up owning the infrastructure of a stolen car operation without having built any of it. Conditions favored the trade. Consumer credit in the modern sense was not available to working people in the 1950s and 1960s. A man who needed several $100s quickly, for a medical bill or a car repair or a gambling debt, had few lawful options. Small businesses were in a similar position, because banks lent against collateral and inspected books, and many small operators had neither. DeMeo's customer list grew accordingly. Court records and reporting describe his borrowers as concentrated in the automobile trade, which mattered later, but they also included a dentist's office, an abortion clinic, restaurants, and flea market operators. For cover, he was carried on the books of a Brooklyn company called S&C Sportswear Corporation, and he told his neighbors in Long Island that he worked in construction, food retailing, and the used car business. By 1963, the income from lending was large enough that DeMeo, then 22, left his legitimate job at a Banner Dairy supermarket to work full-time on it. He ran the business out of a bar at the corner of Flatlands Avenue and Troy Avenue in Brooklyn. and by 1965, that bar was the place where anyone wanting to do business with him arranged to meet. He also began fencing stolen goods there. The bar drew a particular clientele. Among its regulars were relatives of the Profaci family boss, Joseph Profaci, and a young man named Frederick DeNomi, who would spend the next 2 decades in DeMeo's crew and would eventually testify against it. Around 1966, he met a 16-year-old named Chris Rosenberg, who was selling marijuana at a Canarsie gas station. DeMeo lent Rosenberg money so he could deal in larger quantities. By 1972, Rosenberg had brought his own friends into DeMeo's orbit, and those friends became the crew. DeMeo also moved into a business that later drew far less attention than the murders, and produced a great deal of his working capital. He joined a Brooklyn credit union, obtained a seat on its board of directors, and used the position to launder money from his own operations and from drug dealers he had come to know. He built up the lending business with funds taken from the credit union's reserves. Court records and reporting describe him as an officer of a financial institution who was stealing from it. The credit union position also gave him a service to sell. He introduced colleagues there to the business of laundering money for drug dealers, which brought in fees and put him in contact with the narcotics trade that would later become one of the crew's largest and most dangerous lines of work. The relationship that turned a Brooklyn loan shark into a Gambino earner began in the same period. Anthony Gaggi, born Antonino Frank Gaggi on August 7, 1925, was the youngest of 3 children of Angelo and Mary Gaggi, immigrants from Palermo, Sicily. Gaggi left school in the 8th grade to work in his father's barbershop and learned lending there. His criminal career developed under the mentorship of his father's cousin, Frank Scalise, a founding member of the Gambino family. Scalise placed Gaggi in a job at a truck dock, where he became a supervisor and then a ghost employee, drawing pay while working full-time as a lender. Gaggi's own record predates DeMeo by a considerable margin. In October 1960, he took part in the murder of a mobster named Vincent Squillante, who was suspected of having killed Scalise. Montiglio, Gaggi's nephew, later described his uncle's account of that killing to investigators. By the time Gaggi met DeMeo, he had been an inducted member for years, and had come up under the leadership change that followed the murder of Albert Anastasia, after which Carlo Gambino took over the family. DeMeo at that stage had connections to the Lucchese family, and a reputation as a capable earner. Gaggi persuaded him to work for the Gambinos instead. The 2 men began making joint loans to the same customers. By 1970, DeMeo was working for Gaggi formally and paying him a weekly tribute. He had married in 1960. His wife was Gladys Rosamond Britton, and they had 3 children. The family lived on Long Island, in a house in Massapequa Park, at a remove from Brooklyn that let DeMeo keep the 2 halves of his life separate. His son Albert later wrote a memoir about growing up inside that arrangement, and most of the personal detail that circulates about Roy DeMeo comes from that book rather than from any court record. Understanding what that arrangement meant requires the structure above it. An American Mafia family in that period ran on fixed ranks. A boss at the top, with an underboss and a consigliere beneath him. Then a layer of captains, each running a crew tied to a neighborhood or a line of business. Then soldiers, who were the formally inducted members. Beneath all of them sat the associates, the largest group, who did most of the work without belonging to anything. The line between soldier and associate carried real consequences. Initiation required Italian descent, a sponsor already inside, and approval from the leadership. An inducted member could not be killed without permission from the top, and that rule was enforced. An associate had no such protection. He took orders, paid tribute upward, and could be killed on a captain's word without anyone above being consulted. The practical effect on a man in DeMeo's position was constant. Thousands of associates across New York spent entire working lives generating income for people who could have ordered their deaths without consulting anybody. Several of the men who worked out of the Gemini Lounge died that way, and so eventually did DeMeo. Money moved in the same direction as rank. A crew earned, the captain took a share, and a portion traveled to the boss. In return, the crew received permission, protection, and access to connections it could not have built alone. New York held 5 of these organizations at once, and disputes crossing between them went before a body made up of the bosses. That arrangement existed to keep the peace, because open fighting between crews attracted police attention, and police attention cost money. A captain running 10 or 15 men did not need approval for daily business, and the leadership above him did not want a detailed account of it. He needed approval for two things. Killing an inducted member of any family required it. So did anything large enough to bring pressure onto the organization as a whole. Everything else was his to run. Nothing in that structure was designed to restrain violence for its own sake. The design controlled which violence happened, so that the organization was not exposed by it. A killing that solved a problem quietly was acceptable. A killing that put police on a street corner was not. Most of the deaths in this story follow that logic exactly, and the two occasions when the crew broke it are the two occasions that produced arrests. By the opening of the 1970s, DeMeo had money on the street across Brooklyn, a fencing operation, a seat on a credit union board, a growing collection of businesses taken from defaulted borrowers, and a captain above him who could carry a request to the head of the family. He had also assembled something most lenders of his generation did not have, which was a permanent group of young men who lived nearby, answered only to him, and were available at any hour. Carlo Gambino led the family that carried his name until his death in 1976, and Paul Castellano succeeded him. Castellano's approval, or his refusal, decided several of the killings in this story. Gaggi was the inducted member in the partnership. DeMeo was not, at least not at first. One version has him formally inducted in 1977. Others describe him as an associate throughout, and no court document fixes a date. The question is unresolved. In 1972, the two men forced their way into a partnership with a company that illegally processed X-rated films. Pornography distribution was a natural fit for the loan sharking business. Adult film operations of that period ran almost entirely on cash, from customers with no interest in being identified, and they operated under legal exposure that made it impossible for an owner to complain to the police about anything. In June 1973, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that shifted the test for obscenity toward local community standards, which increased the exposure of distributors shipping across multiple jurisdictions. The man running the film processing company DeMeo and Gaggi moved in on was named Paul Rothenberg. Within a year of that partnership being forced on him, he was dead, and his death is the first killing that reporting on this crew attributes to Roy DeMeo. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The bar at Flatlands in Troy had operated under another name before DeMeo took it over. Attached to the back of it was a residential apartment, occupied by his first cousin. Court records would later describe 7 separate criminal businesses running out of that one building. Section 2. The Gemini Lounge. By 1972, the crew had a permanent base. The building stood on the corner of Flatlands Avenue and Troy Avenue in Brooklyn, at 4021 Flatlands Avenue, 2 stories of brick with a bar taking up the ground floor. It had been operating as Phil's Lounge. Under DeMeo, it became the Gemini Lounge, and for the next decade it served as the headquarters of what a federal prosecutor later described as the most violent crew ever brought to trial in a federal court. The building still stands. The space that held the bar is now occupied by a church. Attached to the rear of the bar, connected directly to it, was a residential apartment. The man who lived there was Joseph Guglielmo, DeMeo's first cousin, an older man known around the crew as Dracula. Popular accounts sometimes attach that nickname to Joseph Testa. The record attaches it to Guglielmo. The layout is the central physical fact of the case. A bar has customers, and customers are witnesses. An apartment reachable through the bar, occupied by a relative, gave the crew a private space that could be entered from the street without anyone on the street seeing where a person ended up. A bar also suits a criminal operation for ordinary commercial reasons. It runs on cash, so money passes through without explanation. It gives men a reason to sit in one place for hours every day without appointments. The same faces arriving daily is the definition of a neighborhood bar rather than a sign of anything, and whoever controls the door controls who is present for a conversation. The working day had a shape. Men arrived in the afternoon and stayed into the night, and business came to them rather than the other way round. A borrower behind on payments was summoned rather than visited. A man with a proposition brought it to the bar and waited. Extortion worked the same way. A business owner who had fallen behind, or who operated in a trade that could not call the police, came to the bar and paid. The premises themselves became collateral. Over a decade, DeMeo acquired interests in a peep show business, automobile shops, a credit union board seat, and pieces of assorted small enterprises, none of which he had bought. The arrangement concentrated a decade of criminal activity into one address, which suited the operation while nobody was watching it, and became a serious liability once somebody was. When a federal appeals court in Manhattan came to describe what had operated out of that corner, it identified the group as the DeMeo crew, a component of the Gambino organized crime family, and listed the businesses. The list covered kidnapping, loan sharking, the distribution of narcotics, pornography, extortion, and a conspiracy involving firearms, and it closed with the operation of an international ring dealing in stolen cars. Those businesses supported one another. Defaulted loans produced ownership of small premises, and those premises became storage, meeting places, and fronts. The stolen car operation needed a body shop, and a body shop was exactly the kind of business a defaulted borrower signed over. Pornography distributors needed protection they could not request from the police. Narcotics generated cash that had to pass through something, and a cash bar serves that purpose. The firearms conspiracy the appeals court listed is the least discussed of the 7 businesses and the most practical. A crew committing killings at the rate the cooperating witnesses described needed a supply of weapons that could not be traced to anyone, needed silencers, and needed to dispose of guns after use. Henry Borelli was carrying a silenced .45 caliber automatic in 1979 and threw it off a bridge the same night he used it. Weapons of that kind do not come from a shop, and organizing their supply and disposal is a standing criminal operation in its own right. Narcotics also sat outside the rules. The Gambino family formally prohibited dealing, and the prohibition had nothing to do with morality. Federal drug sentences were long, and a man facing 20 or 30 years behaves differently from a man facing 3. The difference shows up in how quickly he begins talking to prosecutors. A boss who banned narcotics was protecting himself from the cooperation that long sentences produce. DeMeo dealt anyway, and so did most of the crews that were told not to. According to Montiglio, DeMeo also became a silent partner in a peep show and prostitution business in New Jersey in 1975, after its owner defaulted on a loan, and he handled categories of illegal film that Gaggi ordered him to stop dealing in, under threat of death. DeMeo continued, Gaggi did not act, and the payments kept coming. None of that was ever charged, and it reaches the record through Montiglio rather than through any court finding. The men who ran it were young and local. Joseph Testa was born on January 24, 1955. Anthony Center was born on March 31, 1955. They grew up together in Canarsie, came into the crew through Chris Rosenberg as car thieves, and were known as the Gemini Twins. They worked as a pair for their entire careers, were tried together, acquitted together in 1986, and convicted together in 1989. Harvey Rosenberg, born October 6, 1950, in Canarsie, went by Chris, and also used the names Chris DeMeo and Christopher Rosalia. He had met DeMeo in 1966, at 16, selling marijuana at a gas station, and he brought in the friends, who became the rest of the crew. He was Jewish, which meant he could never be formally inducted into an Italian-American crime family regardless of his standing with DeMeo. Rosenberg's use of the DeMeo surname followed from the same limitation. He could not be made, so he attached himself to the man who ran the crew and borrowed the name to announce whose protection stood behind him. The arrangement worked until it identified the wrong man to people capable of retaliating. Henry Borelli joined the crew in late 1974. Accounts consistently describe him as willing to shoot anyone and unwilling to take part in dismemberment, a division of labor that became a point of friction inside the group. Frederick Denome served as DeMeo's driver, and his brother Richard Denome also worked with the crew and owned a cabin cruiser used on at least one occasion to dispose of remains. Patrick Testa, Joseph's younger brother, owned a body shop. Joseph Guglielmo held the apartment. Vito Arena and Carlo Profeta came in later. Above all of them was Anthony Gaggi, the captain, who was not a daily presence in the bar, but whose permission the significant decisions required. Between the two worlds moved Dominic Montiglio, born July 17, 1947, Gaggi's nephew, who collected payments from DeMeo for his uncle, and spent enough time in both places to understand the arrangement from the top and the bottom at once. Montiglio became a government witness in 1983, after being arrested and after learning that a contract had been taken out on his life. Much of what is publicly known about the inside of the Gemini Lounge exists because he described it from a witness box. He also said in an interview that if the crew went a week without killing at least 3 people, the men became depressed, a remark that illustrates both the scale the insiders described and the difficulty of verifying any of it. The number attached to this crew is the reason the story circulates, and it needs stating carefully. Published figures run from 25 to 75 to 100 to 200. Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capecci, the journalists who wrote the definitive book on the group, documented 75 victims and reported that the Joint Police and FBI task force credited the crew with that number. The jacket of their book puts the FBI's estimate at a minimum of 200. Other reporting puts the FBI's suspicion at between 100 and 125. Walter Mack, the federal prosecutor who tried the case, was asked years afterward what he believed the real total was, and put it between 150 and 200. None of those figures is the finding of a court. No jury counted to 200 or to 75, and no judgment in the federal reports puts a total on what this crew did. The numbers that do appear in court documents are smaller and more specific. On October 4, 1984, federal prosecutors filed a 78-count indictment naming 24 defendants and alleging 11 separate conspiracies. Among the roughly 80 racketeering acts set out in it, 26 were murders. The government publicly attributed 25 killings to the crew, and 6 of those 25 were dead members of the crew itself. One account of the 2 trials that followed states that Henry Borelli, Joseph Testa, and Anthony Center were convicted of a collective total of 25 murders across both proceedings. 6 crew members counted among the victims matters for the sections that follow. Roughly a quarter of the people the government attributed to this enterprise were the enterprise's own personnel. Very few criminal organizations lose that share of their membership to internal killing and continue operating. This one did, for another 4 years. The car ring is the reason the government could count anything at all. Vehicle theft and export generate titles, registrations, shipping manifests, insurance claims and dealership records, and paper of that kind survives, gets subpoenaed, and gets shown to juries. Bodies destroyed and dispersed into a municipal landfill generate nothing. The most provable crimes this crew committed were its property crimes, and the killings that made it notorious rest most heavily on the testimony of men who were themselves killers and who traded that testimony for sentencing consideration. Both of those things are true at once, and the honest version of this story holds them together rather than choosing between them. The gap between 25 and 200 is not evidence that the higher figures are inventions. It reflects the method. A crew that destroys bodies destroys the evidence that would allow anyone to count them. The popular total is an estimate made by investigators and journalists. The number established in court is far lower and far more specific. That distinction is where the comparison in the title becomes useful rather than decorative. The crew depicted in Goodfellas was real, and it was not this one. Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, and Thomas DeSimone worked for the Lucchese family out of a bar in Queens called Robert's Lounge. DeMeo worked for the Gambinos out of a bar in Brooklyn, about 15 miles away, across the same years. The two worlds touched. The murder that drives the middle of that film was the killing of William Bentvena, known as Billy Bats, a Gambino man killed by Lucchese associates. The trouble it caused on screen is the trouble it caused in life, because killing an inducted member of another family without permission was the one prohibition that was enforced. Thomas DeSimone's own disappearance was later attributed, through Henry Hill's account, to John Gotti. And Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, after DeMeo's death, were formally inducted into the Lucchese family, the same organization the Goodfellas crew belonged to. The difference is in the documentation. The Goodfellas story reached the public through one cooperating witness, Henry Hill, and the book Nicholas Pileggi wrote from his account. Little of the violence in it was proven in court. Jimmy Burke was never convicted of the killings that followed the Lufthansa robbery. His convictions were for a conspiracy to fix college basketball games and for the murder of Richard Eaton. The DeMeo crew produced 2 federal trials, a set of reported appellate decisions that remain in the law reports, 3 insiders who testified in detail about murders they had committed themselves, and sentences of life imprisonment plus 20 years. The 3 insiders admitted, between them, roughly 20 killings of their own as part of their cooperation. That figure is itself a measure of how the numbers work in this case. 3 men who were not the leadership, testifying about their own conduct under oath with sentencing consequences attached, accounted for roughly 20 deaths between them. The leadership above them was never in a position to be questioned, because Castellano, Gaggi, and DeMeo were all dead before the racketeering counts reached a jury. Frederick Denome admitted 8. Vito Arena admitted 4. Montiglio described the structure from inside it. Measured against a single cooperating witness whose account was dramatized 20 years later, that is a different order of evidence, and it is the basis on which the comparison in the title holds. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In the summer of 1973, police raided a film processing plant in New York and questioned its owner about checks he had written to Roy DeMeo. 3 weeks later, DeMeo asked the man to meet him at a diner to discuss who would pay his legal fees. They arrived at the same time. Section 3. Paul Rothenberg. July 29, 1973. An alley off Northern Boulevard in the Roslyn area on the North Shore of Long Island. Paul Rothenberg, a pornography distributor of about 42, was shot twice in the head with a silenced .38 caliber handgun. Roy DeMeo fired the shots. Anthony Gaggi had given the order. Nobody was ever charged with the killing. It does not appear as a count producing a conviction in the federal appellate decisions that came out of this crew 2 decades later. The date, the manner of death, and the general location are consistently reported. No court record fixes the precise spot. The version that follows draws on reporting and on the reconstruction Mustaine and Capecci assembled, and it is presented on that footing. Rothenberg ran an illegal pornography production and distribution operation described in that reporting as the largest of its kind in New York. In 1972, DeMeo and Gaggi forced their way into a partnership with the film processing side of it. Rothenberg made payments to both men from then on. He had already been paying before that. Accounts describe him as making extortion payments to DeMeo and Gaggi prior to 1972, which is how the two men came to understand what the business was worth and decided to take a share of the processing side of it directly. The reason the adult film business attracted that kind of attention has to do with the law rather than with any weakness particular to Rothenberg. Obscenity prosecutions in that period were frequent, and the standards used to determine what counted as obscene varied between states and sometimes between counties. Material sold openly in one city could put a distributor in front of a grand jury 300 miles away. In June 1973, weeks before Rothenberg died, the Supreme Court issued a decision that moved the test for obscenity toward local community standards, which increased the exposure of anyone shipping across jurisdictions. A distributor operating under that exposure could not report an extortion demand, because reporting it meant describing his own operation, his suppliers, his customers, his laboratory, and his shipping to the authorities. His realistic options were to pay or to close. That structural vulnerability is why organized crime moved into the adult film trade across the 1960s and 1970s in most large American cities, rather than only in New York. The business generated cash, could not use the courts, and had owners with a permanent incentive to keep their operations out of any official record. An extortion arrangement of that kind settles into a rhythm. Somebody explains that the business now has a partner and names a figure. The figure is set carefully, high enough to be worth collecting, and low enough that the owner keeps trading, because a business that closes stops paying. Somebody arrives weekly. The owner learns to have the money counted. Over time, the payment becomes a fixed cost budgeted alongside rent, and years can pass in that pattern without a single act of violence. The cash side of the trade mattered as much as the legal exposure. Adult theaters, bookshops, and mail-order operations took in currency nobody was going to declare in full, from customers who would never complain to anyone about anything. Money moving through that business was untraceable at both ends, which made it useful for laundering income from elsewhere. Film processing left him particularly exposed. Adult films of that period were shot on physical stock and had to be developed somewhere, and commercial laboratories would refuse the work or report it. So the business needed its own processing, which meant premises, equipment, chemicals, and staff at a fixed address. A distributor could conceal his customers and disguise his shipping. A laboratory he could not hide. In the summer of 1973, police raided the plant. Accounts differ on how far Rothenberg went after that. Several sources state that he began cooperating with the district attorney's office, informing on the extortion and naming DeMeo. Others described the crew as having concluded he would make a deal, without stating that he had. Either way, investigators had questioned him about checks he had written to Roy DeMeo. Checks created a particular problem. Cash leaves nothing behind, while a check leaves a record in two banks carrying a date, an amount, a signature, and a named payee. It establishes a financial relationship between two men in a form a jury can hold. The only remaining question would be what the money was for, and the only person able to answer it was the man who had signed them. Gaggy ordered the killing. 3 weeks after the raid, DeMeo arranged to meet Rothenberg at a diner, telling him the meeting concerned who would pay his legal fees. By one telling, Rothenberg had been arrested and released on bail and was awaiting trial at the time. The two men arrived at the diner together. DeMeo produced the handgun, took him into a nearby alley and shot him. Accounts vary slightly on the number of shots. The Mob Museum's account describes 2 rounds fired into his head. Other reporting describes several. The silenced weapon appears consistently across accounts, and a silencer is a meaningful detail, because it indicates a killing planned in advance rather than a confrontation that escalated. The division of roles in that killing matches the structure described earlier. Gaggy decided, and DeMeo carried it out. DeMeo was the more physically capable of the two, and by every account the more willing. But the authority to order a death sat with the inducted member above him. That distribution is a large part of why federal prosecutors a decade later wanted a racketeering case rather than a murder charge. A murder charge reaches the man who fired. A racketeering charge reaches the man who gave the order, without requiring proof that he was in the room. Rothenberg is described in most accounts as DeMeo's first killing for the Gambino family. The description carries a qualification. A first killing is close to impossible to establish. The claim originates in books and later journalism rather than in a court, and one victim list that catalogs the crew's murders notes explicitly that whether Rothenberg was the first will probably never be known. From 1973 onward, the crew's use of murder as a routine business tool is a matter of record. The Rothenberg killing established DeMeo's usefulness inside the organization. Gaggy had doubted how far DeMeo would actually go. After Rothenberg, he stopped doubting, and he began using DeMeo for matters that had nothing to do with business risk at all. 2 killings from 1976 show the change. On May 20, 1976, DeMeo and Henry Borelli killed Joseph Brocchini, a mobster known as Joe Bacchini, who had beaten DeMeo in a fistfight. Brocchini was an inducted member of the Lucchese family, which meant the killing required approval from Castellano that Gaggy did not obtain. Gaggy authorized it off the record and instructed DeMeo to stage it as a robbery. Neither man was implicated in it until years later, by which point DeMeo was dead and Gaggy was in custody. On June 12, 1976, DeMeo and Gaggy killed Vincent Governara, a young man who had broken Gaggy's nose in a fight years earlier. Montiglio was present. Neither of those killings solved a business problem. Both were settlements of personal grievances, carried out by a captain and his earner using an apparatus built for something else. Both killings are known from the testimony of the crew's own cooperating members, and neither produced a charge at the time. The Brocchini killing carried a risk the crew normally avoided. Killing an inducted member of another family without the boss's approval was the offense the organization treated as unforgivable, and Gaggy authorized it anyway, rather than take the request to Castellano. The staged robbery was the cover. Employees at Brocchini's office were held while the place was ransacked, and the killing was made to look like the end of a holdup that went wrong. The killing also set the pattern that governs almost every death that follows. Rothenberg was killed because he was in a position where cooperating made sense, and the men above him decided the position itself was intolerable. Whether he had already begun cooperating changes the moral arithmetic very little from their side. The decision was made on the basis of risk, rather than on the basis of anything he had actually done. Once a crew operates on that reasoning, the list of people who have to die stops being a list of enemies and becomes a list of everybody who knows anything. A borrower under arrest knows things. A car thief pulled over knows things. A crew member with a drug problem, who talks in bars, knows things. Over the following decade, each of those categories produced bodies. The reasoning also carried a cost. The men applying it did not appear to calculate. A crew that kills people for being in a position to talk teaches everyone around it that loyalty offers no protection and silence offers none either, because the decision is made by somebody else on the basis of risk. Those conditions manufacture cooperating witnesses. 3 of the men who eventually destroyed this crew in court had watched it kill people who had done nothing except become inconvenient. The same reasoning explains why the crew eventually turned on its own. A man who had worked beside DeMeo for 10 years, and a man who had borrowed from him last month, presented the same category of exposure once police began asking either of them questions, and the same solution was applied to both. Geography made the early killings harder to connect. Rothenberg died on the North Shore of Long Island, outside New York City, which put that investigation with different authorities from the ones covering Brooklyn. Crimes committed by one group across multiple jurisdictions routinely fell through the gaps between police departments. A shooting in Nassau County, a body shop in Brooklyn, and a shipment leaving from a dock elsewhere were 3 separate matters handled by 3 separate agencies, none of them holding the whole picture. Closing those gaps is what the federal case eventually did. More than a decade later, the Rothenberg case also shows the limits of what survives. The crew's earliest killings are the least documented, and they are least documented because they worked. Nobody was charged, nobody testified, no forensic case was built. Rothenberg's name survives at all because investigators and journalists went back over the ground 20 years afterward and reconstructed what they could find. The reconstruction had a specific source. When the Joint Task Force broke the crew in the early 1980s and its members began cooperating, those men described killings going back a decade, including ones nobody had connected to them. Most of what is known about the crew's first 6 years reaches the public through that channel, which is to say, through the recollections of participants negotiating their own sentences, filtered through journalists who checked what they could against police files. When a killing produces a trial, it produces a transcript, exhibits, sworn testimony, and rulings that can be checked line by line. When it produces nothing, what survives is what people remembered and what reporters were able to confirm. A considerable share of what circulates about Roy DeMeo comes from the second category, none of which makes the crew less dangerous. A group that leaves behind 100 unprovable killings is harder to prosecute than one that leaves behind 10 provable ones, which was the entire object. One further point about the pornography business belongs here, stated at the level the record supports. Beyond the film processing partnership, Montiglio described DeMeo dealing in categories of illegal material that Gaggi ordered him to stop handling under threat of death. DeMeo refused and continued. Gaggi took no action, and the weekly payments continued. That episode was never charged, and it reaches the record through a cooperating witness rather than through any legal finding, and it is noted here without further detail. The film processing company itself continued operating after Rothenberg's death. The extortion income continued, so did the partnership DeMeo and Gaggi had forced on the business in 1972, now with nobody left who could describe how it had been obtained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In November 1974, someone fired 3 rifle rounds through a garage door in Canarsie and hit Chris Rosenberg in the jaw and the arm. Rosenberg survived, wore a beard for the rest of his life to cover the scars, and decided he knew who had done it. The man he blamed owned a chop shop and had been buying stolen cars from the crew for years. Section 4. The Killing of Andre Katz. June 13, 1975. The meat department of a supermarket in Rockaway Beach, Queens. Andre Katz, a young owner of an automobile repair shop in Canarsie, who had been DeMeo's partner in a stolen car ring, was stabbed repeatedly in the heart and then in the back with a butcher knife. He was then decapitated, and his head was crushed in a machine used for compacting cardboard boxes. His body was cut apart, wrapped in plastic bags, and put into the supermarket's dumpster. The dispute that produced that killing had been running for 8 months. Katz bought and sold cars through the DeMeo crew in the early 1970s and socialized with its members. In late 1974, he was arrested over a stolen vehicle he had bought from them, and he blamed Chris Rosenberg for the arrest. The dispute escalated. Katz was pulled from his car and beaten badly enough to be hospitalized. His brother Victor later testified in court that Andre had identified the 2 men as Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, and that while still in hospital, Andre had sworn to get revenge. On November 13, 1974, Rosenberg opened his garage door and was hit by 3 rounds from an automatic rifle. One struck his lower jaw, one his right arm, and a third aimed at his chest glanced off him. He survived. He underwent reconstructive surgery and wore a beard for the rest of his life to cover the scarring. The shooter was never identified, but Rosenberg and the crew assumed it was Katz. While Rosenberg was still in hospital, DeMeo met with his men, and it was decided that Katz would be killed. That decision preceded any question of informing. The crew had settled on killing Katz over a shooting they believed he had carried out, in a dispute that had begun over a stolen car and a blamed arrest. The informing came afterward and removed whatever caution remained about the timing. Then Katz did something that removed any remaining hesitation. In January 1975, he went to the Brooklyn District Attorney's office of his own accord and told them that Chris Rosenberg was heavily involved in automobile theft. DeMeo learned about the meeting immediately afterward from a nipped auto crimes detective on his payroll. In May 1975, Katz appeared before a Brooklyn grand jury and described what he knew about the crew's activities. Direct action against him was considered too risky, given the violence already exchanged. Henry Borelli, who had joined the crew shortly after Rosenberg was shot, proposed using a woman he knew as bait. Her name was Babette Judith Questel. On the evening of June 13, 1975, Katz arrived at her apartment complex expecting to take her out and was seized there by Rosenberg, Borelli, Testa, and Center. He was driven to the supermarket, where DeMeo was waiting. The choice of location is the part of the killing that connects to everything the crew did afterward. A supermarket meat department has drainage, cutting surfaces, refrigeration and industrial equipment, and it is empty at night. The crew used one before it had the apartment behind the Gemini Lounge organized for the same purpose. The stabbing is attributed to Rosenberg, in revenge for the shooting that had damaged his face. Days later, a pedestrian walking his dog saw one of Katz's legs lying on a curb near the store. Police found the remains in the dumpster. They told the press only that a brutal killing had occurred. 2 days after that, dental records identified the body as Andre Katz. The recovery also gave investigators physical evidence, which is why this killing is documented in a way most of the crew's later work is not. Law enforcement and later Jerry Capecci were able to reconstruct the sequence partly from the remains themselves. First-hand accounts of what happened in the meat department do not exist. The record holds a body that was examined and a set of cooperating witnesses who described the events a decade afterward. That identification matters more than it sounds. The crew had gone to considerable effort to make the body unusable, and the body had been found and named anyway. Dominic Montiglio testified years later that he learned about the killing from Rosenberg shortly afterward, and that Rosenberg told him Katz's murder had led DeMeo and the crew to decide that future conflicts would be settled by dismemberment in a way that made the victim disappear entirely. The procedure they settled on became the most repeated element of the whole DeMeo story, and it is usually described with more confidence than the evidence supports. The version that circulates runs as follows. The victim is brought through the side door of the Gemini Lounge into the apartment at the rear. He is shot in the head with a silenced pistol. A towel is wrapped around the wound to keep blood off the floor. He is stabbed in the heart, which stops the heart pumping, and therefore stops the bleeding. The body is placed on plastic sheeting in the main room and dismembered, with the arms, legs, and head removed. The parts are bagged, packed into cardboard boxes, and driven to the Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn, where the daily volume of household waste made recovery effectively impossible. That description comes from members and associates of the crew who became government witnesses in the early 1980s, and from the reconstruction Mustaine and Capeti built from their reporting. None of it is a forensic finding, and the reason is built into the method. The purpose of the procedure was to ensure no body existed to examine. A successful application of it destroyed the evidence that would have documented it. One widely repeated claim about the landfill is simply wrong. Investigators never excavated the Fountain Avenue dump. A joint federal and state task force targeting the crew in the early 1980s considered a plan to dig out sections of it in order to recover remains, and abandoned the plan as too costly and unlikely to produce meaningful evidence. The landfill closed in 1985, was capped, and the site is now parkland. No search of it for this crew's victims was ever carried out. The Gemini Lounge was not the only location used. Where a victim could not be brought there, other places were used, and Richard Denome's cabin cruiser was used at least once to dispose of remains. Some killings were deliberately left visible. When the object was to send a message to informants or to anyone who had shown disrespect, bodies were left in the street to be found. That distinction matters for anyone counting. The crew's disappearances are almost entirely unprovable, while the killings intended as messages are the ones that generated police reports, press coverage, and, occasionally, charges. The victims whose names are known are disproportionately the ones the crew wanted found. Katz's murder produced a prosecution, which distinguishes it from most of what this crew did. Joseph Testa and Henry Borelli were arrested in connection with it. Accounts of the outcome differ. Some state that they stood trial in 1976 and were acquitted. Others state that the case collapsed when a witness became unavailable. Every version agrees that no conviction resulted at the time. The 1976 proceeding is the only time anyone stood trial for a DeMeo crew murder while the crew was still operating. Every other prosecution in this story came after 1984, by which point DeMeo was dead, Gaggy was a defendant in a different case, and the men in the dock were being tried for conduct a decade old. For 8 of the crew's most active years, nobody was in a courtroom answering for any of it. Babette Questel, the woman used as bait, testified about the murder, and would testify about it again, more than a decade later, at the crew's second federal trial. Questel's evidence carried a complication of its own. By the time of the second trial, the defense challenged her testimony on the basis that she had been hypnotized in 1975, during the original investigation. Police used the technique in that period, and courts later came to treat it with suspicion, because of the risk of implanted or distorted memory. The trial judge ruled in March 1988 that she could testify despite the hypnosis. That ruling was reported at the time, and is one of the few contemporaneous glimpses of the second trial available in the press record. The strategic logic of the method explains the shape of the prosecution that eventually worked. For most of American legal history, a murder case needed a body, not as a matter of strict law, because convictions have been obtained without one, on circumstantial evidence strong enough to exclude other explanations. But the standard is demanding. Prosecutors have to establish beyond reasonable doubt both that the person is dead and that a particular defendant killed him, while lacking the most persuasive evidence available in any homicide. Juries are reluctant, and defense counsel has an easy argument. A missing man may simply be missing. The statute that changed the arithmetic had been on the books for 5 years by the time Katz died. In 1970, Congress passed the Organized Crime Control Act, and inside it sat the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, with the prohibited conduct set out at Section 1962 of Title 18 of the United States Code. RICO operates differently from an ordinary criminal statute. Rather than charging a person with a crime, it allows prosecutors to charge a person with conducting the affairs of a criminal enterprise. 2 elements carry it. An enterprise has to exist, meaning a group associated together for a common purpose over time. And the government has to prove a pattern of racketeering activity, meaning a series of underlying crimes, called predicate acts, related to each other and to the enterprise. The predicate acts do not have to be crimes the same person committed. A member can be convicted of racketeering on the basis of a pattern conducted by the enterprise he belonged to, provided the government establishes his participation in its affairs. For a crew where the shooters, the drivers, the dealer who moved the paperwork, and the cousin who kept the apartment all did different jobs, that changes everything. Under the older approach, each man had to be tied to a specific killing. Under RICO, the government had to tie each man to the organization. The proof required for that is different in kind. Membership of an enterprise can be established through payments, meetings, telephone records, shared premises, testimony about who took orders from whom, and the ordinary documentary residue of a business. None of it requires a body. For a crew whose entire method was the elimination of bodies, the statute reached past the one defense they had built. Applied to this crew, the enterprise element was close to self-proving. The group had a name other criminals used. It had a fixed address. It had stable membership across more than a decade, a recognizable division of labor, and a captain who answered to a boss. The effect on the murders was decisive. Under the old approach, prosecutors faced a dozen separate investigations, most without bodies, spread across different jurisdictions and departments, each needing independent proof. Under RICO, they could bring one case about one organization, with each killing serving as a predicate act supporting the pattern, and evidence about a murder committed by one member became admissible against the enterprise as a whole. The statute carried further advantages. Convictions brought long sentences. It reached upward to the men who gave orders without requiring proof that they had handled a weapon. and it permitted seizure of assets tied to the enterprise. The delay between the statute's passage and its use against the Mafia has a simple explanation. RICO was complicated, untested, and risky. A prosecutor who charged an enterprise and lost proved nothing, while one who charged a single robbery and won put somebody in prison. Appellate courts had not yet settled what the pattern requirement demanded. It took a decade of rulings filling in the definitions before the statute became reliable, and when the DeMeo crew's convictions reached the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, the court worked through those questions by reference to its own earlier decision in United States against Indelicato. Andre Katz did not live to see any of it. He was a repair shop owner who bought stolen cars, fell out with the men who supplied them, was shot at and beaten, went to a district attorney and a grand jury, and was killed for it 3 weeks after he testified. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the middle of the decade, the crew's car operation had grown past chop shops and local resale. Vehicles stolen off New York streets were being given new paperwork through a licensed dealership and loaded onto ships. One destination was roughly 7,000 miles away. Section 5. The Stolen Car Ring, July 26, 1977. A road in Brooklyn where 2 bodies were left inside a parked car. John Quinn had been in the stolen car business with the DeMeo crew for years. He had run into legal trouble, and it had emerged that he had given information to the authorities. Alongside him was his girlfriend, Cherie Golden, 19 years old, known as Twiggy, who had no role in the business at all. The sequence, as the crew's own cooperating members later described it, was straightforward. Quinn was invited to a meeting at a Brooklyn bar and brought Golden with him, leaving her waiting outside in his car. He went in and was shot with a silenced weapon. She did not hear it. 2 crew members then came out to the car and stood on either side of it, talking to her. As one of them held her attention, the other shot her in the head, and she took a second round in the face as she turned. Neither body was dismembered. Both killings were also carried out without approval from above, which was the second problem DeMeo created that summer. Both were placed in the car and left on a nearby road. DeMeo ordered the killings without seeking approval from above. Golden's death caused problems for him inside the family. Paul Castellano had recently taken over as boss and recognized the murder of a 19-year-old woman as the kind of thing that generates newspaper coverage and police attention. He wanted to know why she had been killed. DeMeo's answer was that she knew too much about Quinn's business dealings. Castellano took no serious action, and the reason generally given is the amount of money DeMeo was producing. Some tellings move this killing forward 2 years, into a separate crisis in 1979. The fuller catalogs of the crew's murders put it in July 1977, and Quinn's place in the car business is what puts both deaths here. Cherie Golden had nothing to do with stolen cars, narcotics, extortion, or anything else this crew did. She was killed because of who she was sitting in a car with. One further detail about her death bears on what the crew was prepared to do afterward. Her killers removed part of her clothing before leaving her body, in order to give investigators a sexual motive to pursue. The purpose was to send the investigation in a direction that had nothing to do with the stolen car business. Castellano's reaction to that killing is the earliest documented instance of the leadership treating DeMeo as a problem rather than an asset. A boss asking why a 19-year-old woman had been killed is a boss calculating press coverage and police attention. He accepted the answer and took no action, and the reason generally given for that is the size of the weekly payments coming up through Gaggy. The same period produced another killing with no business rationale at all. In June 1977, Joseph Testa and Anthony Center shot a 23-year-old named Jerome Hoffaker outside his girlfriend's house, after Hoffaker had been in a fight with Testa's brother Dennis. The girlfriend's brother witnessed the shooting and did not come forward. He knew enough about the crew to understand what cooperating would cost him and his sister. The business that produced her death was, by the second half of the 1970s, the largest thing the crew ran. The Second Circuit set the geography out plainly once the convictions reached appeal. Cars stolen in New York were being exported to Kuwait and other parts of the Middle East, shipped to Puerto Rico, and moved into other states. This was not a chop shop selling parts out of a back lot. It ran across international borders, with a supply chain at one end, a customer base at the other, and people needed at every point between. The mechanics follow from one problem. Stealing a car is easy. Selling one is not, because a car carries an identity. It has a vehicle identification number stamped into the metal in several places, a title document, a registration history, and an insurance record. The moment the owner reports it missing, that identity becomes a liability, and anyone who buys, insures, or registers it risks the theft report surfacing the first time a clerk or an officer runs the number. The value therefore sits in the paperwork rather than in the theft. Each vehicle needs an identity convincing enough to survive being examined. One long-established method involves buying a wrecked vehicle cheaply, keeping its documents, and transferring that lawful identity onto a stolen car of the same make and model. The wreck goes to scrap, and its paperwork continues, now attached to a car that was never damaged. The numbers on the stolen vehicle are altered to match. A licensed dealer can produce that result in ways an ordinary criminal cannot, because a dealership generates title documents, sales records, and transfer paperwork as part of its lawful business. Paperwork from a real dealership looks like paperwork from a real dealership because that is what it is. Export then removes the vehicle from the jurisdiction where anyone is looking. A car reported stolen in Brooklyn does not get run against a New York database once it is sitting on a lot in the Persian Gulf. Domestic resale worked differently and carried more risk. A stolen vehicle sold within the United States remains inside the system that is looking for it, so the paperwork has to be good enough to survive registration in another state and any subsequent traffic stop. Export removed that problem entirely. Puerto Rico occupied a middle position, inside American jurisdiction, but at a remove from New York records. The man who made that side of it work was Ronald Ustica, a car dealer. When the trial court came to assess his role, it found that without him, there could not have been a successful operation at all. He was not a shooter and not a captain. He was the licensed businessman whose signature converted stolen property into merchandise. He was also convicted twice. Ustica was convicted in the first federal trial in 1986 and convicted again in the racketeering trial that ended in 1989, which makes him one of the few figures in this story to be found guilty in both proceedings. The trial court's finding about his indispensability is the closest thing the record contains to a judicial assessment of how the operation actually functioned. The destination was not arbitrary. The oil price shock of 1973 transferred an extraordinary volume of wealth into the Gulf states across a very short period. So countries with small populations suddenly had large sums to spend, and consumer demand ran ahead of what local supply chains could deliver. American cars were desirable, expensive to import lawfully, and slow to arrive. A shipment of nearly new vehicles with clean paperwork found a funded market waiting at the other end. The crew was filling orders rather than stealing cars and then looking for buyers. That relationship also explains why the operation lasted. A ring that steals opportunistically has to find a buyer for every vehicle and takes losses on anything it cannot move. A ring filling standing orders from overseas customers has guaranteed demand, predictable revenue, and a reason to keep a stable workforce of thieves on retainer. That distinction changed the risk. A thief taking any available car can choose quiet streets and unattended vehicles. A thief filling an order has to locate a specific make and model, which means waiting, watching, and accepting exposure. More exposure meant more arrests, and every arrest put another man in a room with detectives asking who he worked for. Around Ustica sat the rest of the machinery. Patrick Testa owned a body shop, and a body shop supplies everything an operation like this needs. Cars are legitimately taken apart there. Metal is legitimately worked, and paint is legitimately changed. A vehicle sitting for a week attracts no attention, and the premises come with tools, a lift, a paint booth, and a locked door. Frederick Denome also operated an automobile shop that the crew used, on Glenwood Road in East Flatbush. Underneath all of it were the thieves who took the cars off the street, working to order and paid by the unit. The thieves were the weak point by design. They were young, numerous, replaceable, and largely outside the crew's discipline, and they were the people most likely to be stopped in a stolen vehicle. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center had themselves come into the crew as car thieves, and had been good enough at it to be promoted into other work. Most were not, and each arrest created a person with something to trade. Export added its own requirements. Cars leave by ship, and shipping generates documents at every stage. Somebody declares what is being exported and to whom. Somebody arranges and pays for freight. Those documents are why the operation needed a licensed dealership rather than only a body shop, because a dealership exporting vehicles raises no questions. They are also why the operation was ultimately vulnerable. Every document created to make the scheme look lawful became evidence once investigators knew where to look. The insurance side compounded that. Vehicles reported stolen generate claims, and claims generate files held by companies that keep records for years and hand them over when subpoenaed. A single fraudulent claim leaves a paper trail connecting a named person to a named vehicle on a specific date, which is the kind of evidence that does not depend on any witness staying alive. Ustika's role illustrates something that runs through the history of organized crime in New York. The violent men attract the attention, and the violence was real, but almost every profitable racket required at least one person holding a license, a permit, or a professional standing, and that person was usually not violent. A dealer who signs paperwork, an accountant who moves money, a union official who can call a work stoppage, a lawyer who structures a transaction. Those people made the difference between a gang that stole things and an enterprise that earned. The scale is visible in what the government eventually charged. The first federal trial dealt with 23 counts of the indictment relating to the car ring alone, involving 10 individuals, and produced fines running to $85,000 against a single defendant alongside consecutive prison terms. Ronald Turekian's conviction included mail fraud arising from false claims submitted to the Aetna Insurance Company, which indicates how the ring monetized vehicles at both ends, once through export and again through insurance. One of the thieves who came into the crew's orbit around 1978 was Vito Arena, an armed robber and car thief. Arena eventually became one of the 3 insiders who testified against the group, admitted 4 murders of his own, and took investigators to sites where bodies had been left. He became a government witness in 1980. Arena's cooperation is the single most damaging thing that happened to the crew before DeMeo's death. He had been inside the operation, he had committed murders himself, and he could take investigators to locations. The FBI used what he provided to take the automobile theft operation apart and to put 2 crew members in prison, which is why by 1982, the men still working out of the Gemini Lounge were operating with a considerably smaller organization and a much larger problem. In 1978, Arena killed a man named Joseph Scorney. The reason had nothing to do with informing and nothing to do with police pressure. Scorney was killed to clear the way for thieves who would take direction more reliably and improve the supply of cars. Arena admitted it, and the Scorney killing went into evidence in the federal case that followed. That killing is the clearest illustration of how the operation generated bodies as a matter of routine. Volume was the object. Volume required a large number of low-level people, and low-level people get arrested, get greedy, get careless, and get frightened. A ring needing hundreds of cars a year needed dozens of thieves a year, and each new thief was another person who knew where the body shop was, who had paid him, and what tended to happen to men who talked. The FBI eventually dismantled the auto theft operation and sent 2 crew members to prison, and Arena's cooperation in 1980 was part of how that happened. By then, the ring had already produced the 2 killings that federal appellate courts would examine in more detail than any others in this story. Those 2 killings happened 11 days after the crew committed the one murder that put an inducted member of the Gambino family in handcuffs at the scene. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In March 1979, Chris Rosenberg arranged to buy a large quantity of cocaine, then robbed and killed the men who came to supply it. He had been using DeMeo's surname throughout. The organization behind those suppliers wanted the man responsible handed over, and it knew him as Chris DeMeo. Section 6. Chris Rosenberg and the Innocent Dead. April 19, 1979. Whitewood Drive in Massapequa Park, on the south shore of Long Island, where Roy DeMeo lived with his wife and 3 children. Dominic Ragucci, 18 years old, a college student who sold vacuum cleaners door to door and had told people he wanted to be a police officer, had parked outside DeMeo's house after a sales meeting. DeMeo had spent several weeks refusing to leave that house because he believed men were coming to kill him and his family. He looked out, saw a young man he did not recognize sitting in a car, and decided the man was part of a hit team sent from Miami. His wife Gladys told him the young man was a vacuum cleaner salesman. DeMeo treated that as cover, on the reasoning that it was the kind of cover he would have used himself. What DeMeo actually believed cannot be stated as established fact. No confession, testimony, or documented statement records his reasoning, and the description above comes from Mustaine and Capezzi's reconstruction. 2 things about it are documented independently of that reconstruction. DeMeo had been told by his own captain to resolve the crisis with the suppliers and had not done so, and Ragucci was found shot to death near Republic Airport at the end of a pursuit witnessed by a large number of people, which is a matter of police record rather than of interpretation. He and Joseph Guglielmo walked toward the car carrying guns. Ragucci put the car in gear and drove. DeMeo and Guglielmo followed in DeMeo's Cadillac, and DeMeo fired at the car roughly 20 times across more than 7 miles of busy streets. Near Republic Airport in East Farmingdale, Ragucci collided with another vehicle at an intersection. With 2 flat tires, he pulled away and drove another 500 feet before the car stopped. DeMeo got out and shot him 7 times at close range, in front of a large number of witnesses, then got back into his car and drove off. Some accounts also place Frederick Denome at the scene. Nobody was ever charged with that killing. The Mob Museum, which maintains a public account of cases where organized crime killed people with no connection to it, lists Ragucci among them. He had wanted to become a police officer. He was working a commission sales job to pay for school. His killing is one of the very few in this story where the entire sequence happened in public, in daylight, in front of witnesses, and still produced no prosecution at all. The public nature of it is the part that stands out against everything else the crew did. A pursuit across 7 miles of Long Island streets, a collision at a busy intersection, a car with 2 flat tires pulling away and stopping again, and a man shot 7 times beside it in front of a crowd. Every element of that is the opposite of the method the crew had spent 4 years perfecting. The Gemini Lounge existed so that killings would leave no scene, no witnesses, and no body. On April 19, 1979, DeMeo produced all 3 in the space of about 15 minutes. Door-to-door sales work was ordinary in 1979, and it put a great many young people onto unfamiliar residential streets. Companies selling vacuum cleaners, encyclopedias, and household goods hired students on commission, gave them a demonstration model and a territory, and sent them out to knock. From inside a house, somebody doing that job looks exactly like a stranger, with no obvious reason to be there. The sales meeting Ragucci had attended that day is the reason he was on that street at all. Commissioned salesmen worked assigned territories and were sent out after a briefing, which put him in Massapequa Park on an afternoon when the man who lived at that address had spent 5 weeks expecting armed men to arrive. The reason DeMeo was in that state goes back 5 weeks. The Gemini Lounge had been moving narcotics for years in violation of a standing Gambino prohibition, and Chris Rosenberg ran that side of the business. In March 1979, Rosenberg arranged a large cocaine purchase and, rather than complete it, robbed and killed the men who came to supply it. The intermediaries have been named in reporting as Charles Padnick and William Serrano. 2 associates of the supplying organization were killed alongside them. Accounts describe that organization as Cuban and also as Colombian, and the crew referred to what followed as the trouble with the Cubans. One of the 4 victims managed to fire 2 rounds during the robbery, hitting Rosenberg in the head and the arm, without injuring him seriously. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center were present for the shootings. The victims of that robbery are the 4 people whose deaths set everything else in this section in motion, and their names have survived only partially. Charles Padnick and William Serrano are named in reporting. The 2 associates of the supplying organization killed alongside them are not consistently named anywhere, and some versions of the story count 4 dead in total rather than 2 plus 2. The count has never been settled in any document. Throughout the arrangement, Rosenberg had used the name Chris DeMeo. That turned a robbery into a crisis. The organization that had lost 4 men and its cocaine went looking for whoever was responsible, and the name it had been given belonged to Roy DeMeo. Rosenberg's use of that name had begun years earlier as convenience or as flattery. He could not be inducted into an Italian-American crime family, so he attached himself to the man who ran the crew and borrowed the surname to signal whose protection stood behind him. It functioned exactly as intended until it identified the wrong man to people capable of retaliating. It made its position known, demanding that the man responsible be handed over, and the alternative it offered was a war against everyone connected to the Gemini Lounge. A demand of that kind put Gaggy in a position with no good options. Handing over Rosenberg meant killing the most productive man in DeMeo's crew, and the person DeMeo was closest to. Refusing meant a war with an organization that had already lost 4 men, and had no reason to observe any of the rules the five families observed among themselves. Gaggy chose the first option and told DeMeo to carry it out. The killings that followed came in quick succession. On March 19, 1979, the crew killed James Padnick, known as Jamie, the son of Charles Padnick. He had come to New York asking questions about what had happened to his father. He was killed because the crew was not prepared to take the risk of finding out what he knew. Jamie Padnick had come to New York to find out what had happened to his father. Charles Padnick had been killed in the robbery weeks earlier, and his son arrived asking questions of the people who had done it. He does not appear to have known that, and nothing suggests he had any involvement in the drug business himself. Accounts of those weeks describe a crew that stopped operating normally. Men moved between locations. Families were sent elsewhere. The bar became a place to watch the street from, rather than a place to conduct business, and the earnings stopped while it lasted. For an operation whose entire advantage lay in being unremarkable, several weeks of visible fear was itself a serious cost. The bar stopped functioning as a place where business was transacted. Men who normally arrived in the afternoon and stayed into the night were instead moving between addresses and watching approaches. Dominic Ragucci was killed in the middle of that. Gaggy's reaction to the Ragucci killing decided Rosenberg's fate. He had already told DeMeo to settle the matter with the suppliers, even if it meant killing Rosenberg, and DeMeo had been stalling. After Ragucci, Gaggy gave the order again and made the reasoning explicit, which was that Rosenberg had to die before there were any further innocent victims. An order of that kind was not supposed to be given twice. If DeMeo refused, the exposure ran to him and to everyone under him. On May 11, 1979, Rosenberg came to the Gemini Lounge for the crew's usual Friday night meeting. Shortly after he arrived, DeMeo shot him once in the head. Rosenberg did not die immediately and got himself up onto one knee. DeMeo hesitated. Anthony Center stepped in and finished it with 4 shots to the head. Accounts differ on who fired what. Some have DeMeo shooting Rosenberg himself from start to finish. The fuller version, with the single shot and the hesitation and Center stepping in, is the one carried by the fuller catalogs of the crew's murders. Borelli, Frederick Denome, and Joseph Testa were in the room as well. Neither version has been tested in a courtroom. Rosenberg was 28. He had met DeMeo at 16, had recruited most of the crew, had been close enough to use DeMeo's surname, and is described as something close to a son to the man who ran it. His body was not dismembered. That was a deliberate departure from the practice the crew had adopted after Andre Katz, and the reason was communication. A body in a landfill tells nobody anything. The suppliers had demanded proof, and proof required a killing that could be read about. The suppliers had made clear that they wanted the killing to appear in the newspapers, so the crew produced a visible one. Rosenberg was put into his own car, which was parked at Floyd Bennett Field in Marine Park, Brooklyn. Henry Borelli then fired more than 24 rounds into the vehicle with a silenced .45 caliber automatic. The silencer was removed, and the weapon was thrown over the Marine Parkway Bridge. Some accounts place Rosenberg's body on Cross Bay Boulevard instead. The more detailed ones put the car at Floyd Bennett Field. Around the same period, the crew killed one of its own for a different reason. Edward Grillo, known as Danny, had borrowed roughly $100,000 from Gaggy and DeMeo and gambled it away. He is frequently described as the first member of the crew killed by the crew. His case shows how the lending business fed the body count directly, because he had borrowed from the men he worked for, which meant his creditor and his employer were the same people, and there was nobody left to appeal to. A borrower on the street who cannot pay loses his business or takes a beating. A crew member who cannot pay has already been extended every consideration available, and the only thing he has left to trade is information. 4 deaths came out of that spring for 4 different reasons. Rosenberg created the exposure. Grillo became a liability through debt. Jamie Padnick came looking for his father. Dominic Ragucci parked on the wrong street. None of those killings produced a murder conviction against a named individual in the federal appellate decisions that came out of this crew. The dates, the sequence, the 7-mile chase, the 20 rounds fired, the hesitation over Rosenberg, and the car at Floyd Bennett Field all rest on cooperator testimony and on the reconstruction Mustaine and Capecci assembled. The killings happened. The specifics of how are secondary material. The distinction is not academic. A viewer told that DeMeo fired 20 rounds across 7 miles is being given a figure from a book. assembled from the accounts of men who were in the car or heard about it afterward. A viewer told that Dominic Ragucci was found shot dead near Republic Airport on April 19, 1979, is being given a fact from a police record. These deaths differ from the earlier ones in who died. Paul Rothenberg was a distributor paying protection. Andre Katz bought stolen cars and then testified. Joseph Scorney was an obstacle to supply. John Quinn had given information to the authorities. Every one of them had chosen to be somewhere near this operation. Dominic Ragucci and Cherie Golden had not. Neither had Jamie Padnick, who came looking for his father. Neither had Daniel Scutaro, who walked into a garage in June 1980 while the crew was cleaning up after another killing. Neither had the eyewitness to the Eppolito shooting, whose only involvement was driving past a parked car at the wrong moment. The crew did not distinguish between people who had chosen to be near it and people who had not. The same reasoning was applied to both categories, and it was applied quickly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. On the evening of October 1st, 1979, the day Pope John Paul II visited New York City, a father and son sat in a parked car in Coney Island with Gadji, DeMeo, and a third man. Both were shot in the head. A driver passing at that moment saw it happen and found a police officer. Section 7, October 1979. October 1st, 1979. Brighton 6th Street at Shore Parkway in Coney Island, Brooklyn, on the evening Pope John Paul II visited New York City. James Eppolito and his son James Eppolito Jr. were sitting in the younger man's car with Anthony Gadji, Roy DeMeo, and a Gambino soldier named Peter Piacenti. The car was parked. Gadji shot the son several times in the head. DeMeo reached across Piacenti and fired into the head of the father. Both men died there. The bodies were found quickly, which was unavoidable given where the car was parked and what had just happened outside it. Within hours, the police had connected the killings to the Gambino family and identified Gadji as a suspect on the basis of the known dispute between the two sides. One clarification belongs at the top, because the name causes constant confusion. These men were related to Louis Eppolito, the New York police detective who was convicted in federal court in Brooklyn in 2006, alongside his partner Stephen Caracappa, of participating in 8 murders on behalf of the Lucchese family. Both received life sentences in 2009 in the case usually called the Mafia cops case. James Eppolito Sr. was Louis Eppolito's paternal uncle. James Eppolito Jr. was his cousin. Louis Eppolito's father Ralph was James Sr.'s brother and also an inducted Gambino member. The family connection is real. The two prosecutions are entirely separate, 27 years apart, and conflating them produces nonsense in both directions. James Vincent Eppolito, known as Jimmy the Clam, was born on December 23, 1916. He was 62. He had been a bookmaker in Gadji's Bath Beach and Bensonhurst crew since the 1930s, and had been arrested 7 times on gambling charges across those decades. He had been an inducted member for many years, made personally by Carlo Gambino, and had at one point held the rank of captain. His brother Ralph Eppolito was also an inducted Gambino member, which is how the family produced a New York police detective in the next generation, who concealed those relationships when he applied to the department in 1969. Under Castellano, his standing had fallen considerably. That decline is the background to everything that followed. A former captain personally inducted by Carlo Gambino would, a decade earlier, have expected his word to carry weight against an earner and a soldier. By 1979, the family was run by a different man with different priorities, and Eppolito appears to have misjudged how much his own history still bought him. James Eppolito Jr., known as Jim, was 33. The two men were part of Gadji's own crew, which is the detail that makes the killing unusual, even by the standards of this story. Gadji did not kill a rival from another family, or an outsider who had crossed him. He killed 2 inducted members of his own organization who worked under him, one of them a former captain, and he did it with the boss's approval. The dispute began with money. Nothing in the origins of it suggested what it would produce. A cocaine transaction had gone wrong, and one party was several $1,000s down, which is the kind of dispute that occurred constantly inside that world, and was normally settled by a payment, a beating, or an instruction from a captain. Jim had recently lost several $1,000s in a cocaine deal, involving members of the DeMeo crew. DeMeo, and afterward Gaggi, accused the younger Ippolito of lying about it and of being a police informant. That accusation put his life at risk, because a member credibly accused of informing forfeited every protection the organization offered. His father went to Paul Castellano to protect him. He told Castellano that DeMeo and Gaggi were dealing narcotics, which carried a death penalty inside the family, and he asked for permission to kill them both. The timing was poor for reasons that had nothing to do with narcotics. Jim had been involved in a children's charity operation that turned out to be a fraud, and the scheme had drawn support from prominent people, including the First Lady Rosalind Carter and Senator Edward Kennedy. When the scam was exposed on the television program 60 Minutes, one of the photographs shown included Jim standing with the president's wife. Castellano was concerned that embarrassing the president could bring retaliation onto the family. Castellano sided with Gaggi and DeMeo and gave Gaggi permission to handle it as he saw fit. The reasoning behind that decision has not been documented in any court record and will not be guessed at here. The position each side occupied can be set out. Ippolito was a diminished former captain, asking permission to kill two men who were producing substantial weekly income for the family. Gaggi was a serving captain and a close ally of the boss. DeMeo was the most productive earner in that part of the organization. And Ippolito's son had just embarrassed the family in a way that touched the president's wife on national television. The killing itself went wrong within seconds. A driver passing at the moment the shots were fired inside the parked car saw enough to raise an alarm and alerted a nearby off-duty police officer. DeMeo and Gaggi separated as they left the scene. DeMeo went one way and was neither arrested nor identified by the witness. The officer found Gaggi walking away, and in the exchange of fire that followed, Gaggi was shot in the neck. He was arrested at the scene, along with Piacenti, who is described as having been present without knowing what was going to happen. Piacenti was 58 and an inducted Gambino soldier. He had been sitting in a car while two men in it were shot dead beside him, and the accounts describe him as an unwitting participant rather than a party to the plan. His presence explains part of why the shooting happened where it did. A meeting in a parked car with a soldier from a different crew in it was the kind of arrangement that reassured the men being lured. Ippolito and his son got into that car, believing they were going to the Gemini Lounge to settle a dispute in front of witnesses from their own organization. For a crew whose method was built on leaving nothing behind, this was the opposite of everything they normally did. Two bodies in the open, a civilian witness, an armed officer within earshot, a gunfight, and one of the two shooters bleeding on the pavement with his identity known. Gaggi was charged with the double murder and with the attempted murder of the police officer. At trial in 1980, he was acquitted of the killings and convicted only of assault. One account records the conviction as attempted assault. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years. Accounts of the case attribute that outcome to jury tampering. Gaggi had bribed a juror. In 1981, his sentence was overturned on appeal, and he was released from prison, and the ground for that reversal was false claims of government misconduct during the trial made by the juror he had bribed. So the tampering appears twice, once in the verdict and once in the appeal that undid the sentence. While Gaggi was in prison, DeMeo served as acting captain of the crew. Most accounts of the DeMeo crew mention what happened to the eyewitness only briefly. Gaggi was sentenced in March 1980. Shortly after the sentencing, DeMeo murdered the witness who had seen the shooting and alerted the officer. That killing is the reason the Ippolito case belongs at the center of this story, rather than at its edge. A civilian, who happened to drive past a parked car, did the thing the justice system depends on people doing. He reported what he saw, and he identified a man. Gaggi went to trial because of him, and within weeks of the sentencing he was dead. His name has not survived in the public record. 11 days after the Ippolito killings, the crew committed the two murders that federal appellate courts would eventually examine in more detail than any others. On October 12, 1979, at Frederick DeNome's automobile shop at 4214 Glenwood Road in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, the crew killed Khalid Daoud, whose full name appears in the record as Khalid Fad Darwish Daoud, and Ronald Falcaro, who was 29. Daoud had contacted law enforcement about DeMeo's automobile theft operation. Falcaro was with him. Both men were shot, and both bodies were dismembered. The participants named in the detailed victim lists are DeMeo, Henry Borelli, Vito Arena, Frederick DeNome, Anthony Center, Joseph Testa, and Ronald Ustica. The presence of Ustica on that list is significant, because Ustica was the licensed car dealer rather than a shooter. A killing carried out at a crew automobile shop, with the dealer who handled the paperwork present, is the point at which the property side of the operation and the violent side of it become the same thing. Daoud had gone to law enforcement about the car ring. The car ring killed him, and the men who moved the vehicles were in the building. Those two killings are the only murders in the crew's entire history that produced convictions reviewed and described with specificity in a published federal appellate opinion. Every other figure in the popular body count exists as estimate, testimony, or reconstruction. Falcaro and Daoud exist in the law reports. Their names also appear in the second trial, which convicted Center and Testa on racketeering counts, including the Falcaro murder. So the same two killings account for the 2 life sentences imposed in 1986 and reversed in 1987, and for part of the 2 life sentences imposed in 1989 that were not reversed. One detail about Daoud went on to decide the outcome for 2 defendants. He was a Jordanian citizen. Prosecutors charged both murders under a federal civil rights statute, an unusual choice explained by the fact that it carried a possible life sentence and could reach a killing directly. That statute protects citizens, and a court would eventually take its wording apart word by word. The killing continued into the following year. In June 1980, Center, Testa, and several other men went to a Brooklyn automobile shop and killed an employee named Charles Mongetor, shooting him 14 times and cutting his throat. The crew wanted him dead because he was pressing charges against the son of a Gambino soldier. A second employee, Daniel Scutaro, walked in while they were cleaning up and was killed as well. Center and Testa were later convicted in both of those deaths, which makes Mongetori and Scutaro 2 of the small number of victims in this story whose killings are attached to a named conviction. The reason Mongetori was killed deserves stating plainly, because it is the same reason as almost everything else in this story. He was not a rival, a competitor, or an informant against the crew. He was an employee at an automobile shop who was pressing criminal charges against the son of a Gambino soldier, which is to say, he was using the courts. Scutaro was killed for being in the building. The immediate consequence for the crew of the Eppolito shooting was the loss of its captain to prison for a period, and a permanent change in what the authorities knew. Before October 1979, the Gemini Lounge operation was a suspicion, a pattern of missing people, and a set of files in different departments that nobody had assembled. Afterward, investigators had a shooting scene, a witness, a wounded and arrested inducted member of the Gambino family, and a documented connection between that man and Roy DeMeo. The method the crew had built was effective against exactly one problem, which was a body producing a murder charge. It did nothing about paperwork, which the car ring generated by the 1,000 pages. It did nothing about informants, which the crew produced faster than almost anybody. And it offered no protection at all against a stranger looking through a windscreen at the wrong moment. 10 years of disappearances, and the case that first put a member of this crew in front of a jury came down to a passing driver and an off-duty officer who happened to be nearby. The crew's response was to kill the driver, which worked in the narrow sense that nobody was convicted of the Eppolito murders, and failed in every larger sense, because by then, investigators had a thread they could work backwards. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the end of 1982, Roy DeMeo had been subpoenaed twice to appear before a federal grand jury. In his final weeks, he was seen wearing a leather jacket with a shotgun concealed underneath it. According to his son, he had begun working out whether he could fake his own death and disappear. Section 8. The Death of Roy DeMeo. January 10, 1983. Canarsie, Brooklyn, at premises belonging to Patrick Testa. Accounts describe the location as either Testa's house or the body shop he operated, Patrick Testa Motors. Roy DeMeo drove there from Long Island for a meeting with members of his own crew. Before leaving the house, he took off his ring and his watch and left them in his study with his wallet and a Catholic pamphlet, where his son Albert found them afterward. That evening, he failed to appear at his daughter Dionne's birthday party. His family understood from that absence that something had happened. The items left in the study are the detail most often cited as evidence that he expected not to come back. A man who removes his ring and his watch before a meeting is either avoiding identification or removing things he does not want taken. Neither reading has been confirmed. and the pamphlet found alongside them has never been explained either. DeMeo had been subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury, and the subpoena had come twice. A grand jury subpoena needs explaining, because the reaction it produced was rational. A grand jury is a panel of citizens convened to decide whether the government has enough evidence to bring charges, and it sits in secret. A person served with a subpoena is legally required to appear and answer questions, and refusal carries a contempt finding and jail. Prosecutors also have a tool that closes the obvious escape. They can grant a witness immunity from prosecution for what he says, and once immunity is granted, the constitutional protection against self-incrimination no longer applies. The witness can answer or go to jail for silence. DeMeo had been through the surrounding process already. His photograph had been taken by the FBI in July 1981, and by the early 1980s, he was under the kind of sustained attention that produces subpoenas rather than arrests. The organization above him could see the same pattern developing. A man in that position is dangerous to the organization above him regardless of his own intentions. He may be entirely determined to say nothing. The organization cannot verify that, and cannot afford to be wrong. DeMeo also knew this better than almost anyone, because he had applied the same reasoning himself for a decade. The men who decided his fate were using a standard he had helped establish, and they were applying it to a man whose own crew had watched him apply it to Chris Rosenberg 4 years earlier. The subpoenas had not arrived without warning. By the early 1980s, the investigation had been building for 3 years. The Eppolito shooting had given investigators a starting point. The FBI had dismantled the automobile theft operation and sent 2 crew members to prison. Vito Arena had become a government witness in 1980. Insurance claims, title transfers, and shipping records were accumulating in places prosecutors could reach with a subpoena, and federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York had begun applying the racketeering statute to organized crime in a coordinated way. DeMeo was not being singled out. He was being drawn into an investigation considerably larger than himself, one that would eventually name 24 defendants, including the head of the family. DeMeo had spent 10 years enforcing exactly this reasoning on other people. Paul Rothenberg was killed because he was in a position to cooperate. Andre Katz was killed for testifying. Chris Rosenberg was killed for creating exposure the organization could not absorb. Danny Grillo was killed because a man who owes $100,000 eventually looks for something to trade. The task force that assembled the case concluded that the order came from Paul Castellano, and that the reason was the obvious one. Castellano was worried that DeMeo would cooperate. From Castellano's side, the arithmetic was not complicated. DeMeo knew about the narcotics business Castellano had banned. He knew what had been done to the Eppolitos, and on whose authority. He knew where a decade of money had gone. A man carrying that information, under a federal subpoena with immunity available, was a threat to the head of the family personally. DeMeo's own position made him easy to remove. His status as an inducted member is unresolved in the record, and if he was an associate, then killing him required nobody's approval beyond a captain's. Gaggy, released from prison in 1981, was available and is one of the men suspected of firing. That release matters to the sequence. Between 1980 and 1981, Gaggy was in custody, and DeMeo ran the crew as acting captain. By January 1983, Gaggy was out, back in position, and had watched DeMeo generate 2 years of exactly the kind of attention the organization existed to avoid. A meeting called by a man's own crew at premises one of them controlled was, by 1983, a recognizable form of danger. Chris Rosenberg had gone to a meeting. Danny Grillo had gone to a meeting. DeMeo went. According to his son, he had been considering faking his own death by having Albert shoot him, and in his final weeks he was seen wearing a leather jacket with a shotgun concealed beneath it. Those details come from Albert DeMeo's memoir, and are identified as such. One description of the killing itself survives. DeMeo was lured to the garage and shot at close range as he was about to be handed a cup of coffee. 10 days later, on January 20th, 1983, his Cadillac Coupe de Ville was found in the parking lot of the Varuna Boat Club on Emmons Avenue in Sheepshead Bay, near the corner of East 28th Street. The car was towed to a nearby station house, where detectives from the Organized Crime Control Bureau searched it and opened the trunk. The body was partly frozen. He had been shot several times in the head and had a bullet wound in his hand, which investigators read as a defensive injury, meaning he had raised an arm as the shooting began. A chandelier was resting on top of him in the trunk. Accounts of the chandelier differ. Most describe it as having been placed on the body. At least one states that DeMeo himself had put it in the car shortly before his death. No explanation for it has ever been established. The detail survives because a police report recorded it. Reports of a body recovered from a vehicle are unusually thorough documents, and everything in and around the car gets itemized. Records of that category are exactly what the crew had spent a decade ensuring nobody would ever produce, and DeMeo's own death produced one. The discovery date is also reported two ways. Most sources give January 20th, 10 days after he disappeared. Some give January 18th, 8 days after. The dates of the disappearance and of the recovery are firmer than the interval between them. The reconstruction the task force settled on held that DeMeo was killed by his own men, in the manner he had used on Rosenberg 4 years earlier. He was invited to a meeting by people he trusted and shot once he arrived. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center were believed to have been present. The government suspected Gaggi of firing the shots. Gaggi had motive of his own by then. He had spent 1980 and part of 1981 in custody over the Eppolito shooting, a case DeMeo's decision to kill in daylight had created, and he had come out to find his earner under federal subpoena and generating the kind of attention the organization existed to avoid. Nobody was ever convicted of killing Roy DeMeo. No indictment charged it, and no jury heard it, and in strict legal terms it remains an unsolved homicide. One further story circulates and requires its label. Anthony Casso, a Lucchese underboss who later cooperated with the government, gave an account in which Castellano first assigned the killing to John Gotti and Frank DeCicco. The two could not get close enough to carry it out, and DeCicco suggested Casso instead, because Casso knew Center and Testa well. Casso was a cooperating witness, placing himself near a famous killing, which is the kind of claim that requires corroboration. No court has adopted it. One claim about this killing has done more damage to public understanding of the case than everything else combined. Richard Kuklinski, a New Jersey man known as the Iceman, said in a series of prison interviews and books that he had murdered somewhere between 100 and 250 people, and that Roy DeMeo was among them. He was convicted of 5 murders. The victims were Gary Smith, Daniel Deppner, Paul Hoffman, Louis Mazgay, and George Maliband. Those convictions are the extent of what any court found against him. His wider claims included the murder of Jimmy Hoffa and the killings of the Bonanno figure, Carmine Galante, and of Paul Castellano, and they are treated across the serious literature as substantially unreliable. The DeMeo claim fails on documented grounds rather than on argument. The FBI had the Gemini Lounge under surveillance, and agents watching that building never observed Kuklinski there. Mustaine and Capecci spent years on this crew, interviewed its cooperating members, and worked through the case files, and their book does not mention him. His own biographer, Philip Carlo, conceded in a postscript that Kuklinski probably had nothing to do with DeMeo's death. Jerry Capecci has disputed any real relationship between the two men, and so has Michael Franzesi, a former Colombo captain with direct knowledge of the period. The 2012 film built around Kuklinski's account is a dramatization of those claims. Anyone who arrived at this story through it is working from a version the people who investigated the crew do not recognize. The claims spread the way false details usually spread. Kuklinski gave broadcast interviews. Books followed the interviews, and a film followed the books, and each retelling treated the previous one as its source. At no point did that chain return to the surveillance logs, the trial record, or the reporting that contradicted it. Accounts of the crew published online still list him among its members. The general point extends past this one case. A man serving a life sentence has no legal exposure left to lose by claiming further murders and considerable attention to gain, while an interviewer or a publisher has commercial reasons to believe him and almost no means of checking. Claims made under those conditions belong in a different category from evidence until something independent supports them. What is documented needs no embellishment. Roy DeMeo was 42. He was killed by people who knew him, on the instruction of the organization he had earned for, because a piece of paper had ordered him to answer questions under oath. He was put in the trunk of his own car and left in a boat club parking lot in the middle of January. His body was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens. He was survived by his wife Gladys and 3 children, none of whom were participants in what he did, and his son published an account of the household years afterward. The crew did not stop. Testa and Center continued operating and were later inducted into the Lucchese family rather than the Gambinos, working for the underboss Anthony Casso. Richard DeNome, brother of the cooperating witness Frederick DeNome, was murdered in 1984, most probably by the remaining crew members, who had reason to fear he would follow his brother. In most investigations, the death of the principal ends the case. Here, it did the opposite, because a racketeering case does not need the leader. Its subject is the enterprise, and an enterprise survives the removal of any individual member. Every man still working out of Canarsie in 1983 remained a member of the same enterprise and remained exposed to the same pattern of racketeering acts. DeMeo's death also demonstrated something to everyone who had worked for him. A man who ran a crew for a decade, earned continuously for the family, and held whatever rank he held could be summoned by his own people and shot on a boss's instruction. Seniority did not protect him, neither did the money he produced. Every person in that organization who had watched it happen to Chris Rosenberg in 1979 now had a second example, and this time the victim was the man who had given the order the first time. They had lost the one person capable of enforcing silence across the whole group. Within that same year, Gaggy's own nephew went to the government. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. On October 4, 1984, the United States Attorney in Manhattan filed a 78-count indictment against 24 men. The first name on it was Paul Castellanos. 14 months into the trial that followed, Castellano was shot dead on a Manhattan pavement outside a steakhouse. Section 9. The first federal trial, October 4, 1984. The Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York in Manhattan, then run by Rudolph Giuliani. A federal indictment was filed running to 78 counts, naming 24 defendants and alleging 11 separate conspiracies. It set out roughly 80 racketeering acts, 26 of them murders. The case is reported as United States against Castellano, because the first defendant listed was Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family. Indictments of that size are rare now, and were rarer then. 24 defendants means 24 sets of defense counsel, each entitled to cross-examine every government witness, file motions, and object. 78 counts means dozens of separate factual allegations, each requiring its own proof. A single jury would have to track which defendant was charged with which act across a period spanning more than a decade, and appellate courts have warned repeatedly about the unfairness that develops when evidence against one defendant carries over onto another. That warning became directly relevant to this case twice. The concern is why Judge Duffy severed the indictment in 1985, and it is the ground on which the Second Circuit reversed 2 convictions from the second trial in 1992. The case was assigned first to Judge Abraham Sofair, and then went to Judge Kevin Thomas Duffy. On September 9, 1985, Duffy severed the indictment for separate trials, sending the non-racketeering charges forward first. The trial that resulted comprised 23 counts of the original indictment relating to the stolen car ring, and it involved 10 individuals. The reasoning was the same reasoning set out earlier. The car ring generated paper, and paper is what juries convict on. Severance carried a cost in exchange, because trying the property crimes separately meant presenting them stripped of the context that made them make sense. A jury hearing about stolen vehicles and export documents would not be told in any sustained way that the men in the dock belonged to an organization that killed people as a matter of routine. The most damaging material sat inside the severed counts, so the first jury heard the least of it. A second reason lay behind the order. The car ring charges rested on witnesses whose accounts could be checked against documents, and the government had those documents. The murders rested on the testimony of cooperating criminals. Leading with the provable case gave the government convictions and a set of judicial findings about how the enterprise operated, which it could then carry into the racketeering trial. The trial ran 5.5 months. 2 things happened during it that no prosecutor could have planned for. Neither event had anything to do with the evidence. Both changed the conditions under which the case was tried, and one of them became a ground of appeal in its own right. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was shot dead on a Manhattan pavement outside Sparks Steakhouse. The lead defendant in the largest organized crime prosecution then running in the United States was killed in the middle of his own trial on a busy midtown street in the evening. His death removed him from the case, and from the leadership of the Gambino family at once, and John Gotti moved into that leadership. Castellano's murder during the trial became one of the principal issues raised on appeal. Gotti's own conviction in 1992 did not rest on evidence from this crew. That case was built on Salvatore Gravano, the underboss who cooperated against him. The DeMeo prosecution is the backdrop to the Gotti era, rather than a source of evidence inside it. The sequence matters, because retellings frequently compress it. Castellano was the lead defendant in a racketeering case built substantially out of the DeMeo crew's activities. He was killed in December 1985 while that case was being tried. Gotti took over the family, and the case against the crew continued without him for another 3.5 years. For the remaining defendants, Castellano's death cut both ways. A dead lead defendant cannot be convicted, and his name came off the case. Against that, the men still on trial had lost the boss whose authority had covered their activities for a decade, at the moment they most needed the organization behind them to hold together. The second event came 2 months later. On February 17, 1986, while the jury was deliberating, Frederick Denome died. His death was ruled a suicide. Denome had been one of the government's witnesses, and across his cooperation he had admitted to 8 murders committed by himself. His brother Richard had been murdered in 1984. The verdicts came in, and judgments of conviction were entered on April 9th and 11th, 1986. The district court described the verdict as having run the gamut, and the tally is recorded in its later opinion. The jury returned 58 guilty findings and 90 not guilty findings, and deadlocked on 2 defendants on 1 count. In the first federal trial of the DeMeo crew, the jury acquitted more often than it convicted. Those totals count findings rather than people, because each defendant faced several counts, and the jury worked through them individually. Even allowing for that, the outcome bears little resemblance to the version of this story most audiences have encountered. Verdicts of that shape are not unusual in very large multi-defendant trials. Months of testimony about dozens of transactions and 24 defendants produces confusion rather than clarity, and jurors who cannot keep straight which man did which thing will acquit rather than guess, which is what the standard of proof instructs them to do. Complexity favors defendants, and the government had assembled the most complex case that courthouse had seen. The government also lost a witness mid-deliberation and its lead defendant mid-trial, either of which would be extraordinary on its own. Neither event helped the prosecution present a coherent case to a jury that had already been sitting for 5 months. The appellate record sets out what happened to each man convicted. Anthony Gaggi was convicted on the conspiracy count and acquitted on every count of transporting stolen property. He received 5 years and a fine of $10,000. Ronald Ustica, the car dealer the trial court had called indispensable, was convicted on the conspiracy count, on the stolen property counts, and on a federal civil rights count connected to murder. He received life on the civil rights count, 10 years on the property counts, and 5 years on the conspiracy, to run concurrently. Peter LaFrocia was convicted on the conspiracy, acquitted on the stolen property counts, and received 5 years. Henry Borelli was convicted on the civil rights count and on the stolen property counts. He received life, plus consecutive 10-year terms, and one account puts the total addition at 150 years, 10 years for each count of automobile theft. Edward Rendini was convicted on the conspiracy and the stolen property counts, and received 5 years plus consecutive 10-year terms, plus a fine of $85,000. Ronald Tarakian was convicted on the conspiracy and on mail fraud, arising from fraudulent claims submitted to the Aetna Insurance Company. He was acquitted on the stolen property counts and received concurrent 5-year terms. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center were acquitted by the jury. Richard Mastrangelo was acquitted by the trial court at the close of the government's case. An acquittal at the close of the government's case is a different thing from a jury acquittal. It means the judge concluded the prosecution had not put forward enough evidence for a jury to convict on, and it is granted before the defense presents anything at all. The 2 men who had spent a decade at the center of what happened in the apartment behind the Gemini Lounge walked out of their first federal trial with not guilty verdicts. The racketeering counts against them had been severed and were still waiting. The statutes involved need translating out of their numbers. The conspiracy count came under Section 371, which criminalizes an agreement between 2 or more people to commit a federal offense, and is among the most frequently used provisions in the federal code. The stolen property counts came under Section 2314, covering the transportation of stolen goods across state lines or out of the country. Section 2314 shows how federal jurisdiction operates. Ordinary theft is a state matter and always has been. The moment stolen goods cross a state line or leave the country, the federal government acquires an interest, because interstate and foreign commerce fall within its constitutional authority. An operation confined to Brooklyn would have remained the New York District Attorney's problem. An operation shipping cars to Kuwait handed the case to the United States Attorney, with federal resources, federal grand juries, and federal sentences behind him. The third statute produced the appeal. Prosecutors had charged the murders of Ronald Falcaro and Khalid Daoud under Section 241, a federal civil rights provision that traces to Section 2 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and its reenactment in the Enforcement Act of 1870. Ordinarily, murder is a state crime over which federal prosecutors have no jurisdiction. Section 241 gave them a route in, and it carried a possible life sentence. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals decided the appeal on January 21, 1987, in the decision reported as United States against Gadji. The court read Section 241 closely and reached a conclusion the government had not wanted. On its own terms, the statute protects citizens, and Khaled Daoud was a Jordanian citizen. As to Ronald Falcaro, the court held that the evidence presented at trial had not established his citizenship beyond a reasonable doubt. Both Section 241 convictions were reversed. 2 life sentences came off. Henry Borelli and Ronald Ustica lost the terms they had received. Everything else in the case was affirmed. The 2 life sentences produced by the first federal trial were both attached to the 2 murders this crew committed that the government could actually prove, and both came off on a question about the nationality of the victims. A statute drafted after the Civil War for an entirely different purpose could not be stretched to cover the killing of a Jordanian national and a man whose citizenship nobody had established. The citizenship problem also shows how thin the proof in these murders was. Establishing that a victim was an American citizen is normally trivial. A birth certificate, a passport, a naturalization record, or a relative's testimony settles it. The government's failure to do it for Falcaro indicates how much of the case rested on the recollections of cooperating criminals rather than on documents. One further point concerns the choice of statute. Prosecutors reached for a civil rights provision because they had no other federal route to a murder charge, and the provision they reached for was written in the aftermath of the Civil War to protect people from conspiracies aimed at depriving them of their rights. Using it to prosecute a mob killing was an aggressive extension, and the Second Circuit declined to extend it that far. The murders themselves were state crimes, and no state prosecution of them followed. Affirming everything else mattered more than it sounds, because the convictions of Gadji, Ustica, Lafrosia, Borelli, Rendini, and Turekian on the conspiracy, property, and fraud counts all survived, and so did the trial court's findings about how the operation had worked. The government's brief on that appeal carried the name of Assistant United States Attorney Walter S. Mack Jr., with Mary Lee Warren arguing. Some secondary accounts render Mack's first name as William. The contemporaneous reporting and the court papers have Walter. Mack is the source of the assessment most often quoted about this crew, and he gave it years after the second trial rather than at the time of the first. The distinction matters, because the man who described the DeMeo crew as the most violent ever prosecuted in a federal court had by then seen both trials through and knew exactly which counts had held and which had not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The severed racketeering counts went to trial in February 1988, before a different judge, and ran for 16 months. When the jury returned, the court clerk needed 23 minutes to read the verdict aloud. The document ran to 58 pages. Section 10, the RICO trial, and what followed. February 22, 1988. A federal courtroom in Manhattan, before Judge Vincent L. Broderick, who had inherited the racketeering counts Kevin Duffy severed 3 years earlier. The charges that carried the murders finally went before a jury. The trial ran 16 months. That figure comes from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which described it in its own opinion as a 16-month jury trial. Contemporaneous news reporting at the time of the verdict called it a 15-month trial, and some later accounts have given 17. All 3 numbers appear in print, and the appeals court is the authority to follow. 12 citizens sat in a Manhattan courtroom for well over a year hearing evidence about killings committed a decade and more earlier. Trials of that length carry a specific risk for the prosecution, because a jury that has heard 14 months of testimony may no longer remember what it heard in month 2. It also carries a risk for defendants, which the appeals court identified afterward. A defendant charged with fraud, who sits through a year of evidence about dismemberment, is being tried in an atmosphere that has nothing to do with the charges against him. The second trial did what the racketeering statute had been written to allow. Rather than asking a jury to resolve a series of unconnected killings, the government asked it to decide whether an enterprise existed, and whether these men had conducted its affairs through a pattern of crimes. Each murder became a component of that pattern, rather than a case standing alone. The absence of a body stopped being decisive, because the question before the jury concerned the character of an organization. One defendant did not live to see the verdict. On April 17, 1988, less than 2 months into the trial, Anthony Gaggi died of a heart attack at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Accounts record that he had told a guard about chest pain some hours before he received treatment. His widow, Rose Gaggi, sued the federal prison system over the care he received, alleging negligence, and she won. That lawsuit is credited with producing improved medical conditions in New York City federal detention. Gaggi was 62. He was the inducted member, the captain, the man who carried the crew's requests up to Castellano and brought answers back. He never faced the racketeering counts. The convictions left on his record from this entire enterprise were the 5-year conspiracy sentence from the Carr trial and the assault verdict from the Eppolito shooting, and that second conviction had already been overturned once. His death also removed the last defendant capable of connecting this crew directly to the leadership of the Gambino family. Castellano was dead. Gaggi was dead. Roy DeMeo was dead. Everyone who had authorized anything at the top of this operation was beyond the reach of a courtroom by the time the racketeering counts were heard, which is a large part of why the 2 men who went to prison for life were the youngest people in the story. The jury was 6 men and 6 women. They began deliberating around June 14, 1989, and returned on June 28. The verdict form ran 58 pages. Reading it aloud took the clerk 23 minutes. 9 of the defendants were convicted. That verdict is the point at which the DeMeo crew as an operating organization ended. The men convicted in it were the remainder of a group that had been running out of one Brooklyn bar since 1972, and the 2 principal defendants had already been acquitted once in federal court on charges arising from the same enterprise. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center were convicted of racketeering and of murder, and here the record contains an unresolved discrepancy that anyone researching this case will encounter. Some sources state that they were convicted on 10 counts of murder. Others report that they were convicted for participating in at least 11 murders charged as predicate acts. One account of the trial states that the men were charged with the killing of 11 victims, and that evidence of an additional dozen murders was presented alongside it. The appellate opinion that reviewed those convictions gives no total, and the only killing it addresses with real specificity is the civil rights murder of Ronald Falcaro. The honest statement is that they were convicted of racketeering and multiple murders, that published sources put the figure at either 10 or 11, and that the discrepancy has never been resolved. They each received life imprisonment, plus 20 years. Sentence was imposed on September 14, 1989. Judge Broderick's remarks were unusually direct for a sentencing. He described the crimes as so horrendous, so inhumane, and so unbelievable that his purpose was to ensure these men would never have the opportunity to commit anything like them again. 4 other men convicted in that trial had their convictions affirmed on appeal. Ronald Ustica was convicted a second time. So were Salvatore Mangiolino, Douglas Rega, and Carlo Profeta. The remaining defendants produced the outcomes that left the government's explanation of Gaggi's earlier assault verdict unproven. Sol Hellman was convicted, and then died, while his appeal was pending. When that happens in the federal system, the convictions are vacated as abated, meaning they are erased, on the principle that a conviction never finally reviewed should not stand against a man who can no longer defend it. Wayne Hellman and Judith May Hellman fared differently again. The racketeering and bribery counts against them were dismissed by the trial judge partway through the case on a motion for judgment of acquittal, which a court grants when the evidence is insufficient as a matter of law. They were convicted instead on mail and wire fraud counts, and Wayne Hellman was also convicted of extortion, which was then set aside. On appeal, the Second Circuit reversed what remained, on the ground of spillover prejudice. These defendants had sat through a 16-month trial, dominated by evidence of dismemberment and mass murder committed by other people, while their own charges concerned fraud. An appellate court reviewing that situation has to ask whether a jury saturated in evidence about killings could fairly weigh comparatively minor financial offenses against defendants sitting beside the men who committed them. The court concluded it could not, reversed the convictions, and permitted a retrial. That result closes the juror bribery thread from 1980. The government's account of why Gaggy walked away from a double murder with an assault conviction was that a juror named Judith Hellman had been bribed with the crew's involvement. The theory was charged, and it did not survive. The racketeering and bribery counts were dismissed at trial. Saul Hellman died, and his convictions were erased. Wayne and Judith Hellman's remaining convictions were reversed. What happened inside that state jury room in 1980 has never been established by any court, even though most accounts of the case treat the bribery as fact, and Gaggy's 1981 release on appeal rested on claims made by the juror in question. The appeal deciding all of this was handed down on January 22, 1992, reported as United States against DeMeo. That same opinion contains the appeals court's description of the DeMeo crew as a component of the Gambino organized crime family. 3 men made the case possible. Frederick DeMeo admitted 8 murders and died on February 17, 1986, during the first trial's deliberations. His brother Richard was murdered in 1984. Vito Arena admitted 4 murders, became a government witness in 1980, testified in detail, including about the killings of Falcaro and Daoud, and took investigators to sites where bodies had been left. Dominic Montiglio went to the government in 1983 after being arrested and after learning a contract had been taken out on his life. He testified across the trials, entered witness protection, was relocated repeatedly, and withdrew from the program in 1993. He later worked with Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capecci on their book about the crew he had grown up around, and spent his later years as a painter. He died on June 27, 2021, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, aged 73. Walter Mack gave his own assessment afterward. As far as his knowledge went, he said, the DeMeo crew was the most violent crew ever prosecuted in a federal court, and DeMeo had dealt in murder on a wholesale basis. The case did not end in 1989 because of a change in federal law that arrived slightly too late to apply. Parole in the federal system was abolished for offenses committed after November 1987. Everything Testa and Center were convicted of predated that, so both men remained eligible for parole despite sentences of life plus 20 years. They served 35 years. Joseph Testa was granted parole on April 30, 2024, and moved to Nevada. His attorney Linda Sheffield told reporters that he had serious medical problems and had done well in prison, and that both factors bore on the release date. He died on January 26, 2026, 2 days after his 71st birthday. Anthony Center's parole was approved in 2022, and he was released in June 2024. He is the only surviving member of the core of that crew. Both men served 35 years of sentences imposed as life plus 20. Their release also drew attention because of who else was left. Roy DeMeo had been dead for 41 years. Nino Gaggi had been dead for 36. Paul Castellano had been dead for 38. Chris Rosenberg for 45. Frederick DeMeo for 38. And Dominic Montiglio, the nephew whose testimony started the process, had died in New Mexico 3 years earlier. Of everyone named in this story, the 2 men who walked out in 2024 were among the last still alive, and one of them lived less than 2 years afterward. A sentence of that description reads as absolute, and to most people it means, a man dies in prison. Parole eligibility attaching to offenses committed before November 1987 is a technical feature of federal sentencing law that produced an outcome most of the public did not expect. Rudolph Giuliani, whose office brought the original indictment, condemned the releases. He said Center should die in prison, described him as a stone-cold killer who enjoyed killing, and said he believed Center had taken part in the dismemberment of bodies. 10 sections cover roughly 50 years here, and one calculation runs through nearly every death in the story. Paul Rothenberg was killed because he was in a position to cooperate and had probably begun doing so. Andre Katz was killed for going to a district attorney and a grand jury. Joseph Brocchini and Vincent Governara were killed over a fistfight and a broken nose. John Quinn was killed for giving information to the authorities, and Cherie Golden was killed for sitting in his car. Joseph Scorney was killed to improve the supply of stolen vehicles. Charles Padnick and 3 others were killed in a cocaine robbery, and Jamie Padnick was killed for asking what had happened to his father. Chris Rosenberg was killed to settle the war his robbery started. Danny Grillo was killed for a debt he could not pay. Dominic Ragucci was killed for parking on the wrong street. James Eppolito and his son were killed for carrying a complaint to the head of the family, and the man who witnessed it was killed for seeing it. Khalid Daoud was killed for contacting law enforcement, and Ronald Falcaro for standing next to him. Charles Mongitori was killed for pressing charges, and Daniel Scutaro for walking in. And Roy DeMeo was killed because a subpoena arrived ordering him to answer questions under oath. 6 of the people the government counted as victims of this enterprise were members of the enterprise. Chris Rosenberg, Danny Grillo, Richard Denome, and Frederick Denome all belonged to the crew, and the first 3 were killed by it. Frederick Denome died during a jury deliberation in a trial he had helped make possible. That list is also incomplete in a way nobody can repair. If the investigators were anywhere near right about the scale, a substantial number of people were killed by this crew whose names appear nowhere, whose disappearances were never connected to a bar in Canarsie, and whose families were never told anything. The method worked. The crew's own cooperating members described killings for which no victim has ever been identified. The catalogs assembled from their testimony carry entries recorded only as unidentified, with a date, a location behind the Gemini Lounge, and a note that a cooperating witness was present. Those entries are the closest the record comes to acknowledging the people the method removed entirely. The enterprise was ended by the thing it had killed all those people to prevent. 3 men talked. Between them, they admitted roughly 20 murders of their own, and traded that admission for sentencing consideration. Their testimony, combined with a racketeering statute nobody had yet learned to use properly when this crew started work, produced 2 federal trials, 9 convictions, and 2 sentences of life plus 20 years. The numbers deserve one last plain statement. Investigators and journalists have put the crew's total at 75, at 100, at between 100 and 125, and at as high as 200. None of those figures is the finding of any court. The indictment alleged 26 murders and the government publicly attributed 25. The killings that produced convictions surviving appellate review are fewer still, and the 2 the courts examined most closely lost their life sentences over the nationality of the victims, which brings the comparison in the title to its conclusion. Measured on documented method, on a fully litigated racketeering enterprise that generated 2 trials and a shelf of published opinions, and on insiders who admitted around 20 killings under oath, the record of the DeMeo crew is worse than anything ever established in a courtroom about the crew in Goodfellas. That crew's violence reaches the public almost entirely through the account of one cooperating witness and the book written from it. Measured on a clean, provable body count, neither crew comes close to its own legend. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.